The crack of Jake Morrison's Winchester shattered the Arizona dawn like thunder-splitting stone. He'd caught sight of movement down by Willow Creek rustlers, most likely watering stolen cattle before pushing them across the border into Mexico. At 45, Jake had seen enough thievery to shoot first and sort the bodies later, but as he crested the ridge overlooking the water, his finger froze on the trigger. A woman stood waist-deep in the creek, her bronze skin gleaming like polished copper in the early light. Water cascaded from her raised arms as she poured handful after handful over her shoulders, washing away what looked like dried blood. Her long black hair hung loose down her back, and she was as naked as the day she was born. Jake jerked his rifle barrel skyward, heat flooding his weathered face. In all his years on this godforsaken patch of Arizona territory, he'd never— "You have seen me without clothes," came a voice clear as creek water and twice as cold. "Now you must marry me or we both die." Jake's head snapped up. The woman had turned to face him, arms crossed over her chest, dark eyes blazing with something between fury and desperation. She was Apache, he could tell from the proud set of her jaw and the way she held herself like a warrior, even standing naked in his creek. "Ma'am, Jake started, then stopped. This had to be some kind of fever dream. Maybe the loneliness had finally cracked his brain like an egg. 7 sons. She continued, stepping toward the bank with no apparent shame about her nakedness. "That is how long the spirits give us to become husband and wife in truth, or they will demand our blood to cleanse the dishonor. Now hold on, My name is Aiyana Crow Feather. I am daughter of Chief Standing Bear of the Chiricahua, and you, white man with the kind eyes and gentle hands, you have doomed us both." Jake blinked hard, wondering if he'd hit his head falling off his horse. But no, there she stood, water dripping from her curves, speaking words that made no earthly sense. "Lady, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding." She reached for something on the bank, a torn and bloody deer-hide dress. As she pulled it over her head, Jake caught sight of an ugly wound in her left shoulder, barely scabbed over. Apache law is clear. When unmarried woman is seen unclothed by unmarried man, they must wed or face death for bringing shame to the tribe. "That's—" Jake shook his head. "That's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard." "You think Apache law is ridiculous?" Her voice carried a dangerous edge. "I think there's got to be some kind of—" Jake stopped mid-sentence as the thunder of hoofbeats rolled across the canyon, at least a dozen riders coming fast from the east. "Who's that?" Aiyana's face went white as bone. "My father's warriors. They have found me." She grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Listen to me, Jake Morrison. How do you know my— If they take me back, I die. If they find you have seen me like this and we are not wed, you die too. The only way either of us lives through this day is if you help me." The hoofbeats grew louder. Jake could see dust rising against the morning sky. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. There's got to be another way. There is no other way. Aiyana's grip tightened. "Unless you want both our scalps decorating my father's lodgepole, you will do exactly as I say." Jake stared into her dark eyes and saw something that hit him like a fist to the gut, pure, undiluted terror. This wasn't some elaborate trick or Apache war party intimidation. This woman was genuinely terrified of those riders. "What do you need me to do?" Relief flickered across her features. "First we run, then we perform the binding ritual before they catch us. If the spirits accept our marriage, even my father cannot break it without bringing down their wrath." "Marriage," Jake's voice cracked like a schoolboy's, "in name only if that is your wish, but it must be real enough to fool the spirits." She was already moving, gathering what looked like a medicine pouch and a bone knife from the rocks. "Can you fight? I was cavalry in the war." "Good. You will need to." She pointed toward the narrow canyon that led deeper into the Badlands. "We go that way. The horses cannot follow easily." Jake shouldered his rifle and followed her into the rocks, his practical mind warring with something deeper, a protective instinct he hadn't felt since his Mary died 7 years ago. Behind them, the hoofbeats reached the creek. Angry voices echoed off the canyon walls, speaking rapid Apache. Aiyana translated without being asked. "They found my tracks. My father is with them. I can hear his voice. He is—" She paused, listening. "He is very angry." "What did you do?" "I refused to marry the man he chose for me." Her voice was steady, but Jake caught the tremor underneath. Broken Hawk is cruel, older than my father, and he has already killed 2 wives. When I said no, he tried to force me. I fought back. That wound on your shoulder. His knife. I escaped, but barely. I have been running for 3 days. She stumbled on a loose rock and Jake caught her elbow. Thank you. They climbed deeper into the maze of red stone, following what might have been an old deer trail. Behind them, the voices grew more distant, but no less angry. Aiyana moved with the fluid grace of someone raised in this country, while Jake's cavalry training kept him steady despite the unfamiliar terrain. Tell me about this marriage ritual, he said as they paused behind a boulder to catch their breath. We must mingle our blood while speaking the ancient words. If the spirits accept our bond, they will send a sign. She touched the bone knife at her waist. It is not comfortable, but it is better than death. Jake studied her profile as she watched the trail behind them. High cheekbones, straight nose, lips pressed thin with determination. She was beautiful in the way a storm was beautiful, wild and dangerous, and utterly beyond taming. Why are you willing to trust me? For all you know, I could be worse than this broken hawk. She turned to look at him, those dark eyes seeming to see straight through his skull. I watched you for 2 days before I came to your creek. You tend sick cattle with your own hands. You buried your dog under the cottonwood tree and put flowers on the grave. You talked to your horse like a friend. She shrugged. Cruel men do not do such things. Something twisted in Jake's chest. You were watching me. I needed to know what kind of man you were before I... She gestured vaguely. Before I made you see me as I am. You planned this. The pieces clicked together like a revolver cylinder falling into place. You weren't just bathing in my creek by accident. I told you Apache law is clear. If unmarried woman allows unmarried man to see her unclothed, they must wed or die. It was the only way I could think of to escape Broken Hawk and still live. Jake stared at her. You're telling me you deliberately got naked in front of a complete stranger to force a marriage? Yes. That's, he searched for words. That's either the bravest or the craziest thing I ever heard. Perhaps both. She almost smiled. But it is also the only thing that gives either of us a chance to see another sunset. A new sound echoed through the canyon horses moving through the rocks closer than before. Aiyana tensed like a bowstring. They are following our trail. We need to reach the sacred place before they catch us, or the ritual will not be binding. She pointed toward a narrow cleft in the canyon wall. Through there. Jake followed her into what felt like a crack in the earth itself. The walls rose so high on either side that the sky became a thin blue ribbon overhead. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, and Jake felt the weight of the stone pressing down like judgment. How far? He asked. Not far. But Jake Morrison, when we reach the place, you must not hesitate. The ritual must be completed quickly, or... The crack of a rifle cut her off. Rock chips exploded from the wall beside Jake's head. Down! He shoved Aiyana toward a wider section of the passage as another shot rang out. They're above us! Jake pressed his back against the stone and peered upward. A warrior's painted face looked down from the rim at least 50 feet up. The man shouted something in Apache, and Aiyana answered. What did he say? He told me to surrender. I told him I would rather die. She touched Jake's arm. The sacred place is just ahead. If we can reach it, go. Jake levered a shell into his Winchester. I'll cover you. Together or not at all? Ma'am, this ain't the time for together. Her voice brooked no argument. If one of us dies, the other dies anyway. Apache justice demands it. Jake bit back a curse. He'd been in some tight spots during the war, but never one quite like this. On 3, 1, 2... They ran. The passage opened into a circular chamber carved from living rock, its walls covered with ancient paintings in red and white and black. In the center stood a stone altar worn smooth by countless ceremonies. Aiyana headed straight for it while Jake took a position near the entrance rifle ready. How long do we have, Cho? He called. Not long. Chai was already cutting her palm with the bone knife, dark blood welling between her fingers. Give me your hand. Jake looked back at the passage, then at this woman who had turned his quiet morning into something out of a fever dream. Everything rational in his mind screamed that this was insane. But the sound of approaching horses was getting louder, and those dark eyes held more courage than he'd seen since the war. He held out his hand. The knife bit deep, sharp pain followed by the warm flow of blood. Aiyana pressed their palms together, and Jake felt her blood mixing with his as she spoke words in Apache that seemed to echo off the ancient walls with more power than their volume should have carried. "What are you saying?" "I call on the spirits to witness our joining. I name you husband in the sight of the sky and the earth and the sacred ancestors. I pledge my life to yours, my strength to yours, my honor to yours, until death claims us both." The painted figures on the walls seemed to dance in the flickering light that filtered down from above. Jake felt something shift in the air around them, as if the very stones were listening. "Now you," Aiyana whispered urgently, "repeat the words in your tongue." Jake looked into her eyes and found himself speaking from somewhere deeper than thought. "I take you as my wife before God and man and whatever spirits watch over this place. I swear to protect you, to stand with you, to honor the bond between us until my last breath." Thunder rolled across the clear sky overhead. Aiyana smiled, and for a moment the terror left her face entirely. "The spirits have heard. We are married now in their sight, and Aiyana," the voice boomed through the chamber like the wrath of God himself. A figure appeared in the passage entrance, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the eagle feathers of a war chief. Even without the ceremonial paint, Jake would have known this man commanded respect and inspired fear in equal measure. "Father." Aiyana stepped forward, still holding Jake's bloody hand. "You are too late. The binding is complete." Chief Standing Bear's eyes moved from his daughter to Jake and back again. When he spoke, his English was perfect and cold as winter wind. "You think to escape justice with this, performance. I think to claim the protection of the ancient laws. This man is my husband, now chosen by the spirits themselves. You heard the thunder." The chief's gaze fixed on Jake like a rifle sight. "You, white man, do you understand what you have done?" Jake straightened to his full height, every inch the cavalry officer he'd once been. "I understand I've married your daughter, sir, and I understand I'll defend her with my life, even knowing she carries another man's child." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He felt Aiyana tense beside him, but he didn't let go of her hand. Even then, Standing Bear studied him for a long moment. Broken Hawk comes with 10 warriors. He claims the right to take back his promised wife, and he cares nothing for spirit marriage to a white man. He will be here before the sun reaches its peak. "Then we'd better be ready for him." Jake raised his rifle. "How many rounds you think 10 Apache warriors are worth?" Something that might have been respect flickered in the chief's eyes. "More than you carry, white man, but perhaps," he looked at his daughter, "the ritual is complete." "Yes, father, the spirits accepted our joining. You heard their voice." "I heard thunder. Whether it was spirits or mere weather, only time will tell." He stepped aside. "Go. Take the old trail to the high country. If you can reach the sacred springs by nightfall, the marriage will have passed its first test." Aiyana squeezed Jake's hand. "And if we cannot, then Broken Hawk will have his way, and I will have lost a daughter and gained nothing but shame." Standing Bear's expression softened slightly. "I didn't want this for you, little one, but you have chosen your path." "I chose life over dishonor, father. And I chose a man who looks at me like I'm worth protecting." The chief nodded slowly. "Then may the spirits guide your steps." He looked at Jake. "White man Jake Morrison of the Circle M Ranch, you have taken on more than a wife this day. You have taken on the honor of our people. Do not make me regret allowing this." "I won't, sir." Hoofbeats echoed from the passage, growing louder. Standing Bear gestured urgently. "Go. The back trail leads to the rim rock. From there you must find your own way." Jake and Aiyana headed for a narrow opening he hadn't noticed before, barely wide enough for one person. As they squeezed through, Jake heard the chief's voice echo behind them. "Tell Broken Hawk that my daughter is wed according to the old laws. If he wishes to challenge this, he may face me at the council fire when the moon is full." The passage led upward through a maze of stone, emerging finally onto a windswept plateau high above the canyon floor. Jake could see for miles in every direction. red rocks and green valleys, mountains purple in the distance, and below them, the tiny figures of mounted warriors gathering around the sacred place. "Which way?" he asked. Aiyana pointed northwest toward a line of peaks that looked impossibly far away. "The sacred springs are in those mountains. If we can reach them before dark, that's got to be 20 miles. 23, and Broken Hawk knows these trails as well as I do." She started walking, favoring her wounded shoulder. "But he does not know them better." Jake fell into step beside her, mind racing through everything that had happened in the past hour. Married to an Apache woman he'd never met before today, carrying another man's child, being hunted by warriors who wanted them both dead. "Aiyana," he said as they picked their way across the broken stone. "Why me? There must be other ways you could have escaped this Broken Hawk." She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "I told you I watched you for 2 days, but I didn't tell you everything I saw." "Such as?" "I saw you at the grave behind your house, the one with 2 wooden crosses and the white stones arranged in the shape of a heart." Her voice was gentle. "I saw you crying." Jake's step faltered. He'd thought he was alone that morning, grieving for Mary and little Thomas on the anniversary of the fever that took them, the memory still cut like a fresh blade. "You buried them yourself," Aiyana continued, "with your own hands in the place where your wife liked to watch the sunrise, and every week since you bring them flowers." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "A man who tends his dead with such care will not abandon his living wife no matter how she came to him." Jake stared at her throat tight. "You're gambling your life on flowers on a grave." "I am gambling my life on the kind of man who puts flowers on a grave every week for 7 years. She reached out and touched his face, fingers gentle against his weathered cheek. "You have lost love before. You know what it is worth." Before Jake could respond, a shout echoed across the plateau. Behind them, riders were emerging from hidden trails, moving fast across the broken ground. Even at this distance, Jake could make out the bright paint and feathers that marked them as warriors. "How many?" Aiyana asked, shading her eyes. Jake counted quickly. 10, maybe 12. "They're spreading out, trying to cut off our escape routes." "Broken Hawk is not stupid. He will send some to the sacred springs to wait for us there while others follow our trail." She bit her lip, thinking, "We cannot outrun them, not on foot, not with my shoulder like this." "Then we make a stand. 12 warriors against 1 white man and a wounded woman." She shook her head. "Even if you shoot like Geronimo himself, we will not live to see sunset." Jake studied the approaching riders, his tactical mind automatically calculating angles and distances. "What if we don't try to outrun them? What if we make them come to us?" He pointed toward a cluster of boulders near the edge of the plateau, where centuries of wind and weather had carved caves and hiding places from the living rock. "That's defensible ground. Water seepage from the rocks shade good fields of fire. We could hold that position for a while. Until they starve us out. Or until your father decides to help us." Aiyana looked surprised. "You think he will?" "I think he's a war chief who doesn't like being told what to do by some young hothead like Broken Hawk, and I think he's a father who loves his daughter even if he doesn't much like her choices." Jake shouldered his rifle. "Besides, you said this marriage had to pass its first test. Maybe this is it." They made their way toward the rocks as fast as Aiyana's wounded shoulder would allow. Behind them, the riders were closing in, their war cries beginning to echo across the empty land. Jake tried not to think about how little ammunition he was carrying or how many ways this could go wrong. The boulders formed a natural fortress with several different levels and escape routes if things went bad. Jake found a position with good cover and clear sight lines, then helped Aiyana settle behind a massive stone that would stop anything short of a cannonball. "How's the shoulder?" he asked, checking his rifle. "It will serve." She had produced a bow from somewhere along with a quiver of arrows. "I am not helpless husband." The word sent an odd thrill through Jake's chest. Husband. He'd never thought to hear that again, never wanted to. But coming from her lips in this place with death riding toward them across the desert, "Aiyana." He caught her eye. "About the baby. I meant what I said. If we get through this, you do not need to pretend it matters to you." "I'm not pretending." Jake thought of little Thomas, barely 3, when the fever took him. I buried one child already. I won't see another one harmed if I can help it. Something shifted in her expression. You would raise Broken Hawk's child as your own. I'd raise your child as my own. Doesn't matter whose blood runs in its veins. For a moment, the approaching danger seemed to fade. Aiyana stared at him as if seeing something she hadn't expected to find. Then the first arrow whistled past Jake's head and the moment shattered. Here they come! The warriors spread out as they approached, using the broken ground for cover. Jake picked his targets carefully, making every shot count. His first bullet took down a horse, sending its rider rolling across the rock. His second caught a warrior in the shoulder, spinning him around and out of the fight. Beside him, Aiyana's bow sang its own deadly song. Her arrows found their marks with precision that spoke of years of training. But there were too many attackers, and they were too smart to bunch up and make easy targets. They're trying to flank us, Jake called, tracking movement among the rocks to their left. I see them. Aiyana shifted position, drawing a bead on a painted figure trying to work his way around their position. Jake, when this is over, if we live... When this is over, Jake corrected, ejecting a spent shell. Not if. She smiled, and in that moment she looked younger, less like a warrior, and more like the woman she might have been in a gentler world. When this is over, I want you to know something. Tell me later. Right now, just... The attack came from 3 directions at once. Warriors boiled up from hidden positions among the rocks, war cries splitting the desert air. Jake's rifle spoke again and again. But for every man who fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. An arrow grazed his temple, drawing blood. Another shattered against the rock beside his head. Aiyana's bow had gone silent when he glanced over. He saw her clutching her wounded shoulder, face pale with pain. Can you shoot? I can try. She knocked another arrow with shaking hands. That was when Jake heard it, a new sound mixing with the war cries and gunshots. Hoofbeats coming fast from the north. More warriors, or, look! Aiyana pointed toward the horizon. A line of riders crested the ridge, eagle feathers and war paint bright in the morning sun. At their head rode Chief Standing Bear himself, lance held high, his war cry echoing across the plateau like thunder. The attacking warriors hesitated, caught between their prey and their war chief. In that moment of confusion, Jake put 2 more bullets where they would do the most good, and Aiyana's bow sang again. My father comes, she breathed. Standing Bear's war party hit the scattered attackers like a hammer blow. In the space of 5 minutes, the fight was over. Most of Broken Hawk's warriors fled toward the canyon, but their leader himself was dragged before the chief. Hands bound his painted face, a mask of rage. Jake kept his rifle ready as Standing Bear approached their position. The chief's expression was unreadable. You fought well, white man. Both of you. Thank you, sir. Jake helped Aiyana to her feet. What happens now? Now. Standing Bear looked at his daughter, then at Broken Hawk, kneeling in the dirt. Now we see if the spirits truly blessed this marriage or if they merely enjoyed the entertainment. Broken Hawk spat something in Apache. Aiyana translated, he says the marriage is false, that I belong to him by right of bride price paid. And what do you say? The chief asked. Aiyana straightened every inch her father's daughter despite her wound and exhaustion. I say the spirits have spoken. Thunder marked our joining and we have shed blood together in defense of our bond. If Broken Hawk wishes to contest this, let him face my husband in single combat. Jake felt his stomach drop toward his boots. Single combat. It is the old way, Standing Bear explained. If Broken Hawk truly believes the spirits were deceived, he may challenge the marriage through trial by combat. Winner takes the woman. And if I refuse, then you are no true husband and my daughter goes with Broken Hawk. Jake looked at Aiyana, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide. Then he looked at Broken Hawk, younger than himself, broader through the shoulders, carrying the scars of a dozen fights. A professional warrior against a rancher pushing 50 with an old war wound that still ached in bad weather. What weapons? Knives, Standing Bear said. First blood ends it. Jake had carried a knife since he was 12 years old, but he'd never fought a man who made his living with a blade. Still, he thought of little Thomas of Mary's grave with its weekly flowers, of this brave woman who had gambled everything on his character. I accept. The circle formed quickly. Warriors from both groups, along with Standing Bear and several tribal elders who had appeared as if from the rocks themselves. Jake stripped off his shirt and checked his knife, a simple tool, not a weapon, but sharp enough to do what needed doing. Broken Hawk smiled as he drew his own blade, a wicked piece of steel nearly twice the length of Jake's. He said something in Apache that made several warriors laugh. "What did he say?" Jake asked. "He said you will bleed like a pig and squeal like one too." Aiyana's voice was steady, but her hands were clenched into fists. "Jake, you do not have to do this. I can find another way." "No." Jake touched her face gently. "You took a hell of a chance on me, lady. Least I can do is try to be worth it." The fight began, with Broken Hawk's rush, his longer blade seeking Jake's heart in one lightning thrust. Jake twisted aside, feeling steel part the air where his chest had been, and slashed back with his own knife. First blood, but not to him. Broken Hawk's war cry turned into a snarl as Jake's blade opened a line across his ribs. Not deep, but enough to draw red. The watching warriors fell silent. "First blood to the white man," Standing Bear announced. "The spirits have—" "No." Broken Hawk's English was harsh but clear. "Not finished. I am not finished." He came again, fury driving him now instead of skill. Jake gave ground, using his cavalry training to stay mobile, letting his opponent's rage work against him. The younger man was stronger, faster, but he was fighting angry now, and angry men made mistakes. The mistake came when Broken Hawk overextended himself on a wild thrust, putting all his weight behind the blade. Jake sidestepped and brought his knee up hard, catching his opponent in the solar plexus. As Broken Hawk doubled over, gasping, Jake's knife found his throat. Not to kill, just to rest the edge against the pulse point where one small movement would end everything. "Yield," Jake said quietly. Broken Hawk's eyes blazed with hate, but he could feel the steel against his neck. Slowly, he let his own knife fall to the ground. Standing Bear stepped forward. "The spirits have spoken clearly. The marriage stands." He looked at his daughter. "You have chosen wisely, Aiyana. This man has honor." As the crowd dispersed, Aiyana threw her good arm around Jake's neck, and he felt her tears against his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being everything I hoped you would be." Jake held her carefully, mindful of her wound. "What happens now?" "Now we go to the sacred springs. If we reach them by sunset, the marriage will be sealed beyond any challenge." She pulled back to look at him. "But Jake, there is something else I must tell you. About the baby." "What about it?" "It is not Broken Hawk's." Her voice was barely a whisper. "The child I carry, it is yours now if you will have it. But its father—" She took a shaky breath. "Its father was a white soldier who took what he wanted and left me to face the shame alone. That is why my father arranged the marriage to Broken Hawk, to hide the dishonor." Jake stared at her pieces falling into place. "You were assaulted. And when I found I was with child, I had two choices: marry Broken Hawk and let him beat me and the baby until one of us died, or find another way." She touched his face. "I found you." The last of Jake's reservations crumbled. This woman had endured more than anyone should have to bear, and still she'd had the courage to gamble everything on the character of a stranger. If that wasn't worth protecting, nothing was. "Then we'd better get to those sacred springs," he said. "I want to make sure you're my wife in every way that matters." Standing Bear provided horses and an escort to the edge of his territory. As they rode toward the mountains, Aiyana pressed close against Jake's back, her arms around his waist. "Are you afraid?" she asked. Jake thought about it seriously. His quiet life was over, that was certain. He was married to a woman he barely knew about, to become father to a child conceived in violence, and he'd just made enemies of some very dangerous people. But for the first time in 7 years, he wasn't alone. For the first time since Mary died, he had someone to protect besides himself. Someone who had chosen him not out of desperation, but out of hope. "No," he said finally. "I'm not afraid." Behind them, the desert stretched away toward the horizon, vast and dangerous and beautiful. Ahead lay the sacred springs and whatever future they could build together. The sun climbed higher, and Jake Morrison rode toward his new life with his Apache wife's arms around him, and the taste of possibility bright in his mouth. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and that he thought was worth any risk. The sacred springs lay hidden in a box canyon 30 miles deeper into Apache territory than any white man had a right to be. Jake Morrison had thought he knew what isolation felt like during his 7 years of widowhood, but riding through this ancient landscape with his new Apache wife pressed against his back made him understand he'd known nothing at all. The springs themselves defied belief, crystal-clear pools fed by underground rivers, steam rising from water heated by the Earth's own fire. Red canyon walls soared 300 feet on all sides, covered with pictographs that seemed to watch their every move. This was a place where the old gods still held sway, where the spirit Standing Bear spoke of felt as real as the stone beneath their feet. "The water will heal your shoulder," Jake said as he helped Aiyana dismount. She'd grown paler during the ride, fresh blood seeping through the bandage they'd improvised from his spare shirt. "First we must complete the ritual." She pointed toward a natural altar of white stone at the center of the largest pool. "7 sons the spirits granted us. If we fail to consummate our bond before the 7th dawn, what happens? The marriage becomes void. Broken Hawk can challenge again, and this time my father cannot protect us." She touched her belly unconsciously. "The child I carry will be born a bastard, and I—" She didn't finish, but Jake could fill in the blanks. Apache justice didn't show mercy to women who shamed their tribes. Jake studied the canyon walls, automatically cataloging defensive positions and escape routes. Old habits from the war died hard. "How will they know whether the marriage is real? The spirits know." Aiyana's voice carried complete conviction. "And if they accept our union, they will show the people a sign that cannot be denied." That night they made camp beside the largest pool. Jake built a small fire, while Aiyana gathered medicinal plants from the canyon walls, her knowledge of healing herbs rivaling any frontier doctor's. By firelight, she cleaned and rebandaged her wound, biting back cries of pain that made Jake's chest tighten. "Let me help," he said. "You have done enough." But her voice held no rejection, only wonder. "I've never had a man offer to tend my wounds before." "Get used to it." Jake tested the water temperature with his fingers. "This marriage might have started as a desperate gamble, but I don't do anything halfway." She looked at him across the fire, shadows dancing on her face. "What if I disappoint you? What if I'm not the wife you need? What if I'm not the husband you deserve?" Jake countered. "We're both taking a hell of a chance here, Aiyana. But I've learned something in my 45 years. The biggest risks usually bring the biggest rewards." She smiled, then the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "You sound like my grandmother. She used to say the spirits favor the bold." Smart woman. She was. She also said that true marriage is not about 2 people becoming one, but about 2 people becoming strong enough together to face whatever tries to tear them apart. Jake poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling toward the star-filled sky. "Speaking of things trying to tear us apart, your father mentioned 7 days. What exactly happens if we prove the marriage is real? Then you become part of the tribe, not just my husband, but a Chiricahua warrior with all the rights and protections that brings." She paused. "But also all the obligations. Such as fighting our enemies, providing for our people, following the laws and customs that have guided us for 1,000 years. Her voice grew serious. "It is not an easy life, Jake Morrison. And once you are adopted into the tribe, there is no going back." Jake thought about his ranch, his cattle, the quiet life he'd built in the shadow of grief. All of that would have to change now. But as he watched Aiyana's face in the firelight, this brave, beautiful woman who'd risked everything on his character, he found he didn't mind the prospect as much as he should have. "What about you?" he asked. "Any regrets about gambling your life on a stranger? Ask me in 7 days." The next morning brought unwelcome company. Jake woke to the sound of horses splashing through the creek that fed the springs, and by the time he'd grabbed his rifle, 3 riders had emerged from the canyon entrance, white men but not settlers. Jake recognized the type, immediately: hard-faced professionals wearing the dust of long trails and the calluses of frequent gunplay, the kind of men who made their living in the spaces between law and chaos. The leader dismounted 50 yards away, hands carefully visible, but never far from his weapons. Mid-30s, clean-shaven except for a mustache waxed to needle points. His clothes were expensive, but travel-worn, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who'd killed before and would again without losing sleep. "Jake Morrison." His voice carried the flat vowels of somewhere back east. "Depends who's asking." "Name's Caleb Thorne. I represent certain business interests with a stake in this territory." He nodded toward Aiyana, who had appeared at Jake's shoulder with her bow in hand. "I understand congratulations are in order." "News travels fast." Faster than you might think. Thorne's smile never touched his eyes, especially when it involves changes in land ownership. Jake felt ice form in his stomach. What kind of changes? Well, now that's where things get interesting. Thorne pulled a folded document from his coat. See, according to territorial law, when a white man marries into an Indian tribe, his property passes into tribal hands, makes it federal land subject to treaty negotiations. I never heard of any such law. Passed last year, part of the Indian Pacification Act. Thorne's voice dripped false sympathy. Of course, most folks don't know about it yet. Shame you didn't have better legal counsel before making such a momentous decision. Aiyana translated rapidly into Apache, speaking to someone Jake couldn't see. He caught movement among the rocks her father's warriors positioned to cover the canyon in case this went bad. What's your interest in this? Jake asked, playing for time while he calculated angles and odds. The Arizona and Pacific Railroad needs a right-of-way through these mountains. Your ranch sits right in the middle of the proposed route. Thorne refolded the document with practiced ease. My employers have been trying to negotiate with the Apache for months, but Chief Standing Bear has been uncooperative. Maybe because you're trying to steal his land. Business is business, Mr. Morrison. The railroad brings civilization, jobs, prosperity. The Apache can't stop progress forever. Thorne's tone hardened. But they can make it expensive enough that certain parties might consider alternative solutions. Such as, oh, I think you know. Thorne glanced meaningfully at Aiyana. Accidents happen all the time on the frontier. Young wives die in childbirth. Grieving widowers sometimes drink themselves to death. Very sad, but these things happen. Jake's finger found his rifle's trigger. That sounds like a threat. Just stating facts about frontier life. Thorne remounted his horse with fluid grace. Think about what I've said, Mr. Morrison. My employers are prepared to be generous with a man who sees reason, but they don't like obstacles. He wheeled his horse toward the canyon mouth, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Morrison, you might want to check your back trail. Word is there's a federal marshal riding this way with some very interesting warrants. Something about stolen Army payroll and desertion charges that never got properly resolved. Jake's blood turned to ice water. The payroll incident, 23 years old and buried so deep he'd thought it was forgotten forever. During the chaos of war's end, his unit had been ordered to transport a strongbox to Fort Apache. They'd been hit by bandits. Most of the men killed, the gold scattered to the winds. Jake had been one of only 3 survivors, and when his commanding officer died of wounds 2 days later, there'd been no one left to verify what really happened. I see you remember. Thorne's smile was a wolf's grin. My employers have access to all kinds of interesting historical documents. Be a shame if they had to turn them over to the authorities. The 3 riders disappeared into the canyon's mouth, leaving Jake staring after them with his world tilting sideways. Beside him, Aiyana lowered her bow but kept it strung. What did he mean about the payroll? She asked quietly. Jake told her. All of it, the ambush, the accusations, the cloud of suspicion that had followed him west after the war. He'd never spoken of it to anyone, not even Mary, but something about Aiyana's steady presence made the words come easier. So you are truly an outlaw, she said when he finished. Like me. You're not an outlaw. You're a woman who refused to be sold like livestock. And you are a man who survived when others did not. Sometimes that is crime enough. She touched his arm. What will you do? Jake looked around the sacred canyon at the ancient walls that had sheltered Apache ceremonies for centuries, at this woman who'd bet her life on his character. What I should have done 23 years ago, stand and fight. Even knowing you might lose everything. I've already lost everything once. It's not as scary the second time. He met her eyes. Besides, I've got something worth fighting for now. That afternoon brought more complications. A dust cloud on the eastern horizon resolved into a column of cavalry, 2 companies at least riding hard under the flag of the United States Army. Jake watched them through his field glasses from a concealed position on the canyon rim. Your federal marshal? Aiyana asked. Maybe. Or maybe Thorne's employers decided to speed things up. Jake studied the approaching troops. Either way, we can't stay here. This place is too sacred to defend. If there's fighting, it should be somewhere else. Where? Jake thought rapidly. Your father's winter camp is 20 miles north. Can we reach it before dark? On foot in rough country with you favoring that old leg wound and me bleeding through my bandages. Aiyana shook her head. We would be caught in the open. Then we go to ground. Find a place to hide until they pass. They will not pass. This is the only water for 50 miles. They will camp here tonight, and in the morning they will search every cave and crevice until they find us. Jake cursed under his breath, trapped between the cavalry below and the sheer canyon walls above, with a pregnant woman who could barely lift her bow. He'd been in worse spots during the war, but not many. There is another way, Aiyana said slowly, but you will not like it. Tell me. We complete the marriage ritual tonight before the soldiers arrive. If the spirits accept our bond and send their sign, my father's warriors will come. And if federal troops are found violating sacred ground, it'll mean war. Yes, but it will also mean the treaty obligations shift. The Army cannot legally operate on recognized tribal land without permission from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and getting that permission takes time. Jake studied her face. You're talking about consummating our marriage to buy time. I'm talking about making our marriage real in every way that matters. Her voice held no hesitation. Do you find the prospect so terrible looking at this brave, beautiful woman who'd chosen him over certain death? Jake found the prospect anything but terrible, but the implications. Aiyana, if we do this, really do this, there's no going back. You understand that there was no going back the moment you chose to help a naked woman in your creek instead of riding away. She moved closer, and Jake caught the scent of sage and juniper in her hair. The question is whether you want a marriage of convenience or a marriage of choice. Before Jake could answer, the crack of a rifle split the evening air. Then another. The cavalry had found their trail. Decide quickly, Aiyana said, reaching for his hand. Because ready or not, our 7 days just became 7 hours. They descended to the largest pool as bullets began to sing off the canyon walls above. The federal troops had found the entrance, but the narrow passage would channel them into a killing ground if Standing Bear's warriors arrived in time. Everything depended on timing, luck, and the goodwill of spirits Jake wasn't sure he believed in. Aiyana stepped into the sacred pool without hesitation, the warm water swirling around her hips as she began unlacing her deer-hide dress. In the gathering twilight, with ancient pictographs watching from the walls and steam rising from the mineral springs, she looked like something from a fever dream, part woman, part myth, entirely beyond anything Jake had ever imagined for himself. The spirits will not be fooled by pretense, she said, letting the dress fall away. If we do this, it must be real, all of it. Jake holstered his weapons and stepped into the pool beside her. The water was blood-warm, heated by the earth's own fire, and when Aiyana's hands touched his chest to help him out of his shirt, he felt something shift in the air around them, as if the canyon itself was holding its breath. Are you certain? He asked, even as his hands found the curve of her waist. I've never been more certain of anything. She pulled him deeper into the pool toward the white stone altar where countless Apache couples had pledged their lives to each other. Kiss me, Jake Morrison. Kiss me like you mean it. He did. And as their lips met above the sacred waters, thunder rolled across the clear evening sky. The sound of gunfire grew closer, but Jake found he didn't care. Nothing existed beyond this moment, this woman, this choice that would reshape both their lives forever. Aiyana's body pressed against his in the warm water skin like silk beneath his hands, and when she whispered his name, it sounded like a prayer. They made love there in the sacred pool while bullets sang overhead and destiny closed in around them like a trap. It was gentle and fierce by turns, careful of her wounds, but urgent with need. And when release finally claimed them both, the thunder came again closer this time, shaking the very stones of the canyon. The spirits have heard, Aiyana breathed against his neck. Listen. Jake listened. The gunfire had stopped. In its place came a sound that raised the hair on his arms, the war cries of 50 Apache warriors descending on the federal troops like avenging angels. Your father, my husband's father now. She smiled and pulled him toward the shore. Come, we should dress before he arrives. I think you have made enough shocking first impressions for 1 week. The battle, such as it was, ended before they'd finished getting dressed. Standing Bear's warriors had the federal troops surrounded and outgunned before the soldiers knew what hit them. When Jake and Aiyana emerged from the canyon, they found two companies of cavalry standing in neat ranks with their hands raised while painted Apache warriors held them at arrow point. Standing Bear himself sat his horse at the head of his war party, eagle feathers stirring in the evening breeze. When he saw Jake and Aiyana appear together, still damp from the sacred pool, his granite expression softened slightly. "The thunder came twice," he said in English. "The spirits are pleased." "What about them?" Jake nodded toward the captured soldiers. "They trespassed on sacred ground during a holy ceremony. By treaty law, they are subject to tribal justice." Standing. Bear's smile was cold as winter wind. "But I am feeling merciful tonight. They may go, but their weapons stay here." The federal commander, a young lieutenant with terror in his eyes, stammered something about orders and jurisdictions. Standing Bear cut him off with a gesture. "You have no authority here, Bluecoat. This is Apache land, and these people are under Apache protection." He looked directly at Jake. "My new son-in-law is a tribal member now. If the white man's government has complaints against him, they may present them at the next treaty council." "And when will that be?" the lieutenant asked. Standing Bear's smile widened. "Oh, I would say never." As the disarmed cavalry rode away into the gathering darkness, Jake found himself surrounded by Apache warriors, congratulating him in broken English and fluent gestures. Someone pressed a cup of tiswin into his hands, the potent Apache beer reserved for special celebrations, and someone else began beating a drum made from elk hide. "What happens now?" he asked Aiyana as the impromptu celebration swirled around them. "Now we go home," she said simply. "To our home, the ranch that is no longer yours alone, but ours together. And Thorn, the railroad. We'll find that forcing a war with the Apache is more expensive than buying right-of-way through other mountains." She leaned against his side, exhaustion finally catching up with her. "But that is tomorrow's problem. Tonight we celebrate surviving our first day as husband and wife." Jake pulled her closer, marveling at how right it felt to hold her like this. 12 hours ago, he'd have been a lonely widower facing the prospect of losing everything. Now he was a married man with a pregnant wife, a new family, and enemies circling like wolves. "Any regrets?" he asked. "Ask me in 60 years, she said, echoing her words from the night before. But this time she was smiling when she said it. The celebration continued long into the night. Jake learned that Apache marriage festivities were elaborate affairs involving dozens of relatives, traditional foods, and ceremonial dances that seemed to go on forever. He also learned that his new father-in-law had a sense of humor, dry as desert wind, but sharp as a skinning knife. "You know," Standing Bear said as they sat around the fire sharing stories and tiswin, "when Aiyana told me she planned to trap a white man into marriage, I thought she had lost her mind." "She told you?" Jake shot a look at his wife, who was pretending not to listen while talking with the other women. "Of course. Apache daughters do not make such decisions without discussing them with their fathers first." Standing, Bear's eyes twinkled. "I told her she was probably going to get herself killed, but I also told her I was proud of her for choosing action over acceptance. And if I'd turned out to be a bastard, then we would have killed you and found her someone better." The chief's casual tone suggested he wasn't entirely joking. "But I watched you for 3 days before she made her move. You are not cruel and you are not weak. That is more than most men can say." 3 days. How many people were watching me? "Enough." Standing Bear gestured toward his warriors. "Half my best scouts have been keeping an eye on your ranch since Aiyana escaped Broken Hawk. We needed to know what kind of man she was planning to bind herself to." Jake felt a chill despite the fire's warmth. "And if you decided I wasn't worthy, then she never would have come to your creek." Standing Bear's expression grew serious. "Do not mistake what happened today for impulse, son-in-law. My daughter has been planning this for weeks. She chose you very carefully." Later, as the celebration wound down and the warriors began bedding down for the night, Jake found himself alone with Aiyana beside the dying fire. She'd changed into a traditional Apache dress, white deer hide decorated with turquoise and silver that made her look like something from a painting. "Your father says you've been planning this for weeks," he said. "Guilty." She didn't look particularly repentant. "I needed to be certain you would not beat me or sell me or treat me like property. Too many white men see Indian women as temporary entertainment." "And what convinced you I was different?" "The flowers," she said simply. "Every week for 7 years you put fresh flowers on your wife's grave. A man who honors his dead wife will honor his living one." Jake stared into the fire, thinking about Mary and little Thomas, about the long years of grief and loneliness that had brought him to this point. "I loved her very much." "I know. And someday, if I am very lucky, you may love me too." Aiyana's voice held no jealousy, only hope. "But even if you do not, I know you will be kind to me. That is more than I dared hope for." Jake turned to study her profile in the firelight, the proud curve of her nose, the determined set of her jaw, the way her hand rested protectively over her still flat belly. This woman had risked everything on his character, had trusted him with her life and her unborn child's future. "Aiyana," he said quietly, "I want you to know something." "What?" "I'm already halfway there." She looked at him, then surprise and something deeper flickering in her dark eyes. "Halfway, where?" "To loving you." Jake reached for her hand, marveling at how small and strong it felt in his. "I've never met anyone braver than you. Anyone more willing to fight for what they believe in. If that's not worth loving, I don't know what is." Tears slipped down her cheeks, and Jake realized it might be the first time anyone had ever told her she was worth loving, just for who she was. "Jake Morrison," she whispered, "you are going to make me cry in front of my father's warriors." "Let them see," Jake said, pulling her closer. "Let them see that their new brother-in-law knows treasure when he finds it." As they sat together under the vast Arizona sky, surrounded by warriors who had accepted him as family and holding a woman who had chosen him over certain death, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 years: genuine happiness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Thorne and his railroad backers wouldn't give up easily, and there were still federal authorities who might try to press old charges. But tonight, beside a fire built from sacred wood in the heart of Apache country, Jake Morrison was exactly where he belonged. "What are you thinking about?" Aiyana asked, settling more comfortably against his side. "Home," Jake said, surprising himself with the honesty. "I'm thinking about home." "Your ranch?" "No." Jake looked down at her, at this brave, beautiful woman who had gambled everything on his character and somehow won. "You. I'm thinking about you." The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling toward the star-drunk sky, and somewhere in the distance a coyote sang its ancient song to the desert night. In a few hours they would ride back to the ranch and begin building a life together, two damaged people choosing hope over fear, love over loneliness. But that was tomorrow's adventure. Tonight belonged to them alone, and Jake Morrison intended to make it count. The crack of a rifle split the morning air as Jake Morrison rode toward his ranch with his Apache wife behind him on the saddle. The bullet took his hat clean off his head, sending it spinning into the desert sage. A second shot shattered a rock 3 feet to his left, spraying granite chips across his horse's neck. "Down!" Jake yanked Aiyana from the saddle as his mount reared in panic. They hit the hard-packed earth behind a boulder just as a third bullet whined past the spot where her head had been a heartbeat before. "How many?" Aiyana whispered, her hand moving instinctively to the knife at her belt. Jake peered around the rock, scanning the rimrock above his ranch buildings. The sun was behind the shooters, making them hard to spot, but he caught the glint of metal from at least 3 positions. 4, maybe 5. They've got us in a crossfire. "Professional." "Professional enough." Jake checked his Winchester counting cartridges automatically. 18 rounds plus the 6 in his Colt, against unknown numbers with superior position. He'd faced worse odds during the war, but never with a pregnant wife to protect. Another shot rang out, this one aimed at their horses. Jake's mount screamed and went down hard, blood spreading from a wound in its chest. The message was clear: no escape. "They're not trying to kill us," Aiyana observed, watching the animal thrash in its death throes. "Not yet." "They want us alive." Jake's jaw tightened. "Which means this isn't random. Someone's paying for a specific outcome." A voice called down from the rocks, too distant to make out words but close enough to carry authority. Jake strained to listen, catching fragments. "Railroad business and reasonable discussion." "Thorne," he muttered. "You sure?" Sure enough. Jake studied the terrain between their position and the ranch house. 50 yards of open ground, maybe less. The corrals would provide some cover, and the house itself was built like a fort. Thick adobe walls, rifle ports cut into the shutters, a clear field of fire in all directions. If they could reach it. Aiyana, how fast can you run? Fast enough. But Jake, when I say go, you run for the house. Don't look back, don't stop for anything. Get inside and bar the door. What about you? I'll be right behind you. Jake levered around into his rifle. But if something happens to me, there's a cache of weapons in the root cellar. Enough ammunition to hold off an army. Nothing is going to happen to you. Maybe not, but if it does, nothing is going to happen to you. Aiyana repeated, her voice carrying the absolute conviction of someone who had already lost too much to fate. Because I will not let it. Jake looked at her, this fierce, beautiful woman who had bound her life to his through courage and desperation, and something that was growing into love, and felt his chest tighten with an emotion he'd thought buried with Mary. Ready? He asked. Ready. Go! They broke cover together, Jake laying down, suppressing fire, while Aiyana sprinted toward the ranch house. Bullets kicked up dust around their feet, but the shooters were having trouble with the angle in the morning sun. Jake's return fire kept their heads down just long enough. A new rifle spoke from the barn loft, the shot so close Jake felt the wind of its passage. He spun toward this fresh threat and saw something that stopped his heart cold. A woman stood in the loft doorway, rifle still smoking in her hands. Blonde hair gleaming in the morning light, blue eyes, cold as winter sky, wearing a blue dress he remembered buying in Tucson 7 years ago. Mary Morrison, his dead wife, very much alive and pointing a gun at his chest. "Hello, Jake," she said, her voice carrying across the yard clear as church bells. "Miss me?" Jake's rifle wavered in his hands. Behind him, Aiyana had reached the porch but stopped at the sound of the shot. Now she stood frozen, staring at the woman in the barn. "That's not possible," Jake whispered. "Oh, it's possible, darling. Difficult, expensive, but definitely possible." Mary stepped to the edge of the loft, rifle trained on him with professional steadiness. "Did you really think a little thing like death could keep me from my husband? You died. I buried you. I buried Thomas. You buried 2 fever victims from the Mexican camp outside Tucson. Poor souls, but they served their purpose." Mary's smile was beautiful and terrible. Amazing what a few dollars can accomplish when applied to the right gravedigger. Jake's world tilted sideways. 7 years of grief. 7 years of mourning. 7 years of flowers on a grave that held strangers. Why? Because I had work to do, Jake. Important work. And I needed you safely out of the way while I did it. What kind of work? The kind that pays very well. Mary gestured with her rifle toward the rocks where the other shooters waited. "Pinkerton Detective Agency at your service, specializing in railroad security and Indian pacification." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. "You've been working for the railroad all along." "Not just working for them, darling. I've been building their entire territorial strategy for 7 years. Every Apache raid, every treaty negotiation, every incident that made settlers demand army protection, all carefully orchestrated to justify what comes next. And what comes next? Total pacification. The Apache driven onto reservations so small they'll starve without government support. And all this lovely land opened up for railroad development." Mary's voice carried the satisfaction of someone explaining a particularly clever chess move. "Your marriage to the chief's daughter was an unexpected complication, but not an insurmountable one." Jake felt rage building in his chest like steam in a boiler. "You killed our son." "Thomas was never our son, Jake. He was yours and some Mexican whore's bastard you were too stupid to recognize." Mary's expression didn't change. "I did you a favor putting him out of his misery." The rifle was in Jake's hands before conscious thought formed. Mary's next words were drowned out by the thunder of gunfire as Jake put 3 rounds through the barn loft as fast as he could work the lever. But Mary Morrison, or whoever she really was, moved like smoke. Jake's bullets splintered wood and shattered glass, but the woman who had destroyed his life was already gone, vanished into the barn's interior like a ghost returning to its grave. "Jake!" Aiyana's voice cut through his rage. "Behind you!" He spun to find Caleb Thorne emerging from the rocks, hands raised but eyes alert. 2 more men flanked him, hard cases with the look of professional killers about them. "Quite a family reunion," Thorne said conversationally, "though I have to say your late wife has some fascinating stories about your war service, that payroll incident, for instance." "Shut up." Now, No need for hostility. We're all reasonable people here. Thorne's smile was oil on water. Your wife, your real wife, the living one, has something we want. You have something we want. I think we can reach an accommodation. What do you want? Simple. Mrs. Morrison signs over her father's cooperation with the railroad survey. In return, we forget about those old army charges, and you two live happily ever after on a nice little reservation. Jake kept his rifle pointed at Thorne's chest. And if we refuse, then your Apache friends discover that their new white brother is actually a wanted federal fugitive. Tends to complicate tribal politics, I'm told. You're bluffing. Am I? Thorne produced a folded document from his coat. Federal warrant signed and sealed. Jacob Morrison wanted for theft of government property and desertion in the face of the enemy. Reward of $500 dead or alive. The warrant looked genuine. Even from 15 feet away, Jake could see the official seals and signatures. Thorne had done his homework. Of course, Thorne continued, if Mrs. Morrison, the Apache, Mrs. Morrison were to meet with an unfortunate accident, the warrant might get lost in the territorial bureaucracy. Paperwork has a way of disappearing when the right palms are greased. You're threatening my wife. I'm explaining realities. Your marriage created a legal complication for the railroad. Solving complications is what I'm paid to do. Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. One shot center mass, and Caleb Thorne would never threaten anyone again. But Thorne's men had their own weapons ready, and Aiyana was still exposed on the porch. "Tick-tock, Mr. Morrison, my patience isn't infinite." That was when the war cry split the morning air like a knife through silk. Apache warriors boiled up from the arroyo behind the ranch buildings, paint bright on their faces, weapons glittering in the sun. At their head rode Chief Standing Bear himself, eagle feathers streaming in the wind, his war lance decorated with fresh scalps. Thorne's men spun toward this new threat, but they were already too late. Apache arrows found their marks with deadly precision, dropping both gunmen before they could fire a shot. Thorne himself dove for cover behind the watering trough, his expensive suit gathering dust and worse. "Father," Aiyana called out in Apache, gesturing toward the barn where Mary Morrison had vanished. Standing Bear's response was sharp and immediate. Half his warriors surrounded the barn while the rest spread out to search the rocks for any hidden shooters. The chief himself rode directly to Jake, dismounting with fluid grace despite his age. "My scouts reported gunfire," he said without preamble. "Are you injured?" "No, but we've got problems." Jake quickly explained about Mary, about Thorne's threats, about the federal warrant. Standing Bear listened without interruption, his granite expression growing darker with each revelation. "This woman who claims to be your dead wife, she is the one who has been stirring up trouble between the tribes and the settlers. Looks that way. And the railroad wants to use her lies to steal our land. That's about the size of it." Standing Bear nodded slowly. "Then we will give them something to remember us by." The chief barked orders in Apache. Warriors began hauling wood from the ranch buildings, piling it against the barn walls. Others brought torches, their flames dancing in the morning breeze. "Wait," Jake said. "If she's in there, then she will burn with her lies." Standing Bear's voice carried the finality of judgment. Some truths can only be cleansed with fire. "Jake, no." Aiyana grabbed his arm as he started toward the barn. "She is not worth your life. She murdered Thomas. She made me grieve for 7 years over an empty grave. She is nothing," Aiyana said fiercely. "A shadow from your past while I am your future. Do not let her destroy what we have built." Jake looked into his wife's dark eyes and saw not jealousy or fear, but absolute conviction. This woman had risked everything to bind her life to his, had trusted him with her heart and her unborn child's future. Whatever Mary Morrison had been to him, whatever pain she had caused Aiyana was right. She was the past, and the past was dead. "Burn it," he told Standing Bear. The warriors touched their torches to the kindling. Flames caught immediately, racing up the barn walls with hungry enthusiasm. Smoke began to pour from the loft where Mary had vanished. That was when the shooting started again. Mary Morrison emerged from the barn's rear door like an avenging angel, her blonde hair singed but her rifle steady. She put 2 quick shots into the warriors closest to her, sending them diving for cover, then sprinted toward the horses her Apache attackers had left ground-tied near the corral. "Stop her!" Standing Bear shouted, but Mary was already mounted and spurring toward the open desert. She rode like someone born to the saddle, low over her horse's neck, making herself a difficult target. Jake brought his Winchester to his shoulder, leading his target finger, taking up slack on the trigger. At this range with a running horse, it would be a difficult shot, but not impossible. One bullet and the woman who had poisoned his life would trouble him no more. But as his sight picture steadied, Mary turned in her saddle and smiled at him. Even at 100 yards, he could see that beautiful, terrible smile that had once made him believe in love. His shot went wide. Mary laughed a sound like silver bells over the crack of gunfire and disappeared into the rocks at the base of the canyon wall. 2 Apache warriors gave chase, but their horses were tired from the hard ride to the ranch. She would escape at least for now. "Let her go," Aiyana said quietly. "She has lost everything that mattered to her. Her plan, her allies, her cover. What can one woman do against all of us?" Jake lowered his rifle, but his eyes remained fixed on the point where Mary had vanished. "You don't know her like I do. She's not finished with us, not by a long shot." Behind them, the barn burned like a signal fire, sending smoke spiraling into the desert sky. Caleb Thorne had used the confusion to slip away, probably following Mary's example and heading for the rocks. But his men were dead, his documents scattered in the wind, his carefully laid plans in ruins. "What about the warrant?" Aiyana asked. Standing Bear smiled grimly and held up a charred piece of paper. "What warrant I see, no warrant here." Jake looked at the ashes of what had once been his old life, literally burning away before his eyes, and felt something shift in his chest. The past was gone, buried under fire and smoke, and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. What mattered now was the future and the woman who carried that future under her heart. "Thank you," he told his father-in-law. "Do not thank me yet. This woman, this Mary Morrison, she will return. And when she does, she will bring more than words and threats." "What do you mean?" "I've seen her kind before. During the first Apache Wars, there was a woman agent who turned tribe against tribe, brother against brother. She called herself by different names, but her methods were always the same: les and poison and death from shadows." Standing Bear's expression grew troubled. "We killed her finally, but not before she had destroyed 3 bands and sent 1,000 warriors to their graves." "You think Mary is the same type? I think your Mary Morrison is very good at her job, and I think her job is to destroy everything that stands between the railroad and what it wants." The chief looked around at his warriors, his expression grave. "Which means she will not stop until we are all dead, or she is." That evening, as they held council around a fire built from the ashes of Jake's old barn, word came from the north that changed everything. A young scout arrived on a lathered horse, his painted face grim with news. "What does he say?" Jake asked, watching Aiyana translate. "Broken Hawk has escaped from the reservation. He has gathered warriors from 3 tribes. Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla. They are moving south toward our territory." "How many? 200, maybe more." Aiyana's voice was steady, but Jake caught the fear underneath. "And they are not coming to trade." Standing Bear listened to the scout's full report, his expression growing darker with each word. When the young man finished, the chief sat in silence for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Broken Hawk believes I have grown weak," he said finally. "That allowing my daughter to marry a white man shows the Chiricahua have lost their warrior spirit. He comes to challenge my leadership and take back what he believes is his by right." Meaning Aiyana. Meaning Aiyana. "And you, son-in-law. He has sworn to take both your scalps and use them to decorate his war lance." Jake felt cold settle in his stomach. 200 warriors led by a man who had personal reasons for wanting him dead. Even with Standing Bear's fighters, they were outnumbered at least 3 to 1. "How long do we have?" 3 days, maybe 4 if we are lucky. "And if we run, then we abandon our winter camps, our supplies, our sacred places, and Broken Hawk becomes war chief of all the southern Apache." Standing Bear's voice carried bitter finality. "My people would rather die fighting than live in shame." Aiyana placed her hand on Jake's arm. "What are you thinking?" Jake stared into the fire, his tactical mind working through possibilities. 200 warriors was a lot, but warriors were not soldiers. They would be brave, individually skilled, but not necessarily disciplined. And if Mary Morrison was involved, which seemed likely given the timing, she would have told them about the ranch's defenses, about the weapons cache, about everything that might give the defenders an advantage. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, that maybe it's time to even the odds. How? By doing something nobody expects. Jake looked around the circle of Apache faces lit by firelight and painted for war. How many of your warriors know how to use dynamite? Standing Bear raised an eyebrow. Dynamite. I've got 2 cases hidden in the root cellar. Was saving it for blasting stumps, but it'll work just as well on war parties. Jake's smile was cold as winter wind. If Broken Hawk wants a fight, let's give him one he'll remember. The war chief grinned, and suddenly he looked 20 years younger. Now you sound like my son-in-law. They spent the rest of the night planning. Jake's ranch sat in a natural bowl surrounded by ridges and arroyos that could be turned into killing grounds with the right preparation. The main house would serve as a final redoubt, but the real fighting would happen in the approach's carefully chosen positions where a few determined defenders could hold off far superior numbers. At least that was the theory. What about civilians? Aiyana asked as they sketched defensive positions in the dirt. The women and children will be taken to the sacred canyon, Standing Bear said firmly. Along with any warriors too old or too young to fight, this is not their battle. It's not their battle either, Jake said, gesturing toward the assembled warriors. I'm the one Broken Hawk really wants. Maybe I should... Should what? Aiyana's voice cut across his words like a blade. Raid out alone to face 200 warriors. That is not courage, husband. That is suicide. She's right, Standing Bear added. And besides, this stopped being about you the moment Broken Hawk declared war on my leadership. Now it is about who speaks for the Chiricahua, an old chief who seeks peace, or a young warrior who believes only in blood. Jake nodded, accepting the wisdom if not the comfort of their words. Around them, warriors checked weapons and sharpened blades, preparing for what might be their last fight. The fire burned lower, but the conversation continued, refining plans and discussing contingencies. It was well past midnight when a new sound drifted across the desert, the distant thunder of many horses moving fast through the darkness. Standing Bear was on his feet, instantly gesturing for silence. Too early, he whispered. They are not supposed to be here for 3 days. Jake grabbed his rifle, checking the action automatically. Unless someone told them we knew they were coming. Mary Morrison. Who else? Jake peered into the darkness beyond the fire's light. How many men do we have here? 20, maybe 25, against 200. Jake had faced worse odds during the war, barely but never with so much at stake. If they lost here, Aiyana and her unborn child would face a fate worse than death. Broken Hawk was not known for his mercy. Can we reach the canyon? Not with them this close. We would be caught in the open. Standing Bear's jaw was granite. We fight here or we die here. Then we fight. The attack came with the dawn, just as Jake had known it would. Apache warriors preferred to strike at first light when their enemies were still half asleep and the sun was behind them. But Jake had learned their tactics during his cavalry days, and Standing Bear's men were ready. The first wave hit the outer perimeter like a flood tide, war cries splitting the morning air. Jake's carefully placed charges detonated in sequence, turning narrow ravines into death traps and sending horses screaming in terror. Warriors were flung through the air like broken dolls, their war paint mixing with blood and dust. But there were too many of them. For every man who fell, 2 more took his place, and Broken Hawk drove his followers forward with ruthless determination. The second perimeter fell within an hour, forcing the defenders back toward the main house. How many left? Jake shouted over the gunfire, reloading his Winchester with practiced speed. Maybe 100. Standing Bear replied, blood streaming from a scalp wound. But we cannot hold much longer. Jake looked around at the remaining defenders. Less than 15 men, now most of them wounded, all of them running low on ammunition. In the distance, he could see Broken Hawk himself, painted for war and carrying the scalps of fallen enemies on his war lance. And beside him, blonde hair gleaming in the morning sun, rode Mary Morrison. She had returned just as Standing Bear predicted, and she had brought an army with her. Jake! Aiyana appeared at his elbow, her own rifle smoking from recent use. The house is our last chance. Jake grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the adobe building that had sheltered his lonely years and now might shelter their last moments together. Once we're inside, we can hold them off for a while, maybe long enough for what? No one is coming to help us. Jake looked into her eyes and saw not fear, but fierce determination. This woman had risked everything to bind her life to his, and now she was prepared to die with him if necessary. The knowledge filled him with a strange peace. "Then we make our last stand count," he said. They fell back to the house in good order, covering each other's retreat while Broken Hawk's warriors howled for blood around them. The thick adobe walls would stop arrows and most bullets, and Jake's weapon cache would keep them fighting for hours. But hours wouldn't be enough, not against these odds. As they reached the porch, Jake turned for one last look at the battlefield. Bodies lay scattered across the ground like broken dolls, Apache and Chiricahua alike, their blood mixing in the desert dust. Smoke rose from burning buildings and carrion birds were already circling overhead. This was what Mary Morrison's schemes had brought them to. This was the price of railroad ambition and territorial politics. But it was also something else. It was the price of choosing love over fear, hope over despair, family over loneliness. Whatever happened next, Jake Morrison had lived fully these past few days. He had found love again, had become part of something larger than himself. And if dying was the price of protecting that love, then so be it. "Ready?" he asked Aiyana as they barricaded the door. "Ready," she replied, checking her rifle one last time. Outside, Broken Hawk's warriors began their final assault. War cries echoed off the canyon walls and the thunder of approaching hoofbeats shook the very ground. Jake Morrison stood beside his Apache wife in the house they would defend to their last breath and waited for whatever came next. The future he thought was about to be decided with fire and blood and the desperate courage of those who had chosen to stand rather than kneel. And one way or another, it would all be over soon. The first war arrow punched through the shutters and buried itself in the adobe wall 3 inches from Jake Morrison's head. He could smell the poison on its tip, wolfsbane and rattlesnake venom mixed with Apache prayers for his death. "How many shells left?" he called to Aiyana, who was reloading by the eastern window. 12. Her voice was steady despite the chaos erupting outside. "You, 8. Jake peered through a rifle port, counting the warriors circling their position like wolves around a wounded elk. "Standing bear. 6 rounds and this old rifle is jamming." The Apache chief worked his action desperately, trying to clear a stuck cartridge. "We need a miracle son-in-law." "Fresh out of miracles." Jake drew a bead on a painted warrior trying to scale the south wall. His shot took the man's center mass, sending him tumbling into the dust. "But I've got plenty of bullets left." Broken Hawk's war cry split the morning air like thunder. Through the smoke and dust, Jake could see him rallying his warriors for another assault. The renegade war chief had painted his face white and black death colors, and the fresh scalps hanging from his lance told their own grim story. But it was the woman beside him that made Jake's blood run cold. Mary Morrison sat her stolen horse like a cavalry officer, her blue dress torn and smoke-stained, but her rifle steady in her hands. Even at this distance, Jake could see her mouth moving as she pointed toward the house, explaining its defenses to Broken Hawk with the precision of someone who had studied every inch of the building. She's telling him about the root cellar, Jake realized. About the weapons cache. "Can they reach it?" Aiyana asked, firing through her window at a warrior trying to circle behind them. "Not while we hold the house, but if they break through." Jake didn't finish the thought. If Broken Hawk's men got their hands on the dynamite and ammunition stored below, this fight would be over in minutes. A new sound drifted across the battlefield, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, dozens of them coming fast from the north. For a moment, Jake's heart leaped with hope, reinforcements, perhaps federal cavalry, finally responding to the reports of warfare. "More warriors," Standing Bear said, grimly lowering his field glasses. 50, maybe 60, flying Broken Hawk's colors. Jake's hope died stillborn. They were already outnumbered 10-1. Adding another 60 warriors to the mix would turn this last stand into a massacre. "Jake," Aiyana's voice carried a strange note, something between fear and wonder. "Come look at this." He moved to her position by the eastern window, following her gaze toward the approaching riders. At first glance, they looked like any other Apache war party, painted faces, traditional weapons horses decorated with symbols of war and death. But something was wrong with the picture. The lead rider carried no scalps on his lance, and his face paint was silver and blue instead of the traditional red and black. Behind him rode warriors Jake didn't recognize, too young, too clean, moving with a discipline that spoke of training rather than tribal tradition. "Those aren't Apache," he breathed. "No," Aiyana agreed. But they're not white men either. Standing Bear had moved to join them, squinting through the smoke at the approaching force. His weathered face creased into a frown, then slowly transformed into something that might have been wonder. "Impossible," he whispered. "What?" Jake demanded. "Who are they?" "Ghosts," the old chief said. "Warriors who died 20 years ago in the white man's war, but if they truly ride again." His voice trailed off into Apache words spoken too softly for translation. The new arrivals hit Broken Hawk's rear guard like a hammer blow. War cries echoed off the canyon walls, but these were different from the traditional Apache calls, deeper, more disciplined carrying harmonies that raised the hair on Jake's arms. Through the dust and confusion, Jake caught glimpses of the fighting. The newcomers moved like professional soldiers, using tactics he recognized from his cavalry days. They didn't charge headlong into battle like traditional warriors. They flanked coordinated, used covering fire with a precision that spoke of military training. "Jesus," Jake breathed. "They're buffalo soldiers." "What?" Aiyana looked confused. "Negro cavalry, but what the hell are they doing here?" His question was answered when the fighting shifted closer to the house. Through the chaos, Jake spotted a familiar figure directing the attack. A tall black man in cavalry blue sergeant's stripes on his sleeve, his face painted with Apache symbols, but his tactics pure, United States Army. "Samuel," Standing Bear shouted from the window. "My brother, you came?" The sergeant turned at the sound of his name, grinning fiercely as he put 2 quick shots into a warrior trying to flank his position. "Couldn't let you have all the fun, old man," he called back in perfect Apache-accented English. Jake stared as pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. "Your brother is a buffalo soldier," was a Standing Bear corrected. "Samuel Walking Bear left the reservation 20 years ago to join the white man's army. He said he wanted to learn their ways of war, to use their own weapons against them, when the time came. And now he returns with warriors trained in both worlds, Apache courage and army discipline. It is what I have prayed for these 20 years. The tide of battle was turning. Broken Hawk's warriors caught between the defenders in the house and Samuel's disciplined fighters began to waver. Some tried to retreat toward the canyon mouth only to find their escape route blocked by more buffalo soldiers emerging from hidden positions. But Broken Hawk himself was far from finished. The renegade war chief rallied his remaining followers around the burning barn, using its smoke as cover while he planned his next move. And beside him, Mary Morrison was already working on a solution to their tactical problem. Jake watched her through his rifle sight, studying the way she moved, the way she gestured toward different positions around the ranch. She was planning something, he was certain of it, something that would turn their temporary advantage into a permanent defeat. She's going for the dynamite, he realized suddenly. What? Mary. Look at her, she's positioning men around the root cellar entrance. If she can get inside... Jake grabbed his rifle and started for the door. I have to stop her. Jake, no. Aiyana caught his arm. It's suicide out there. It's suicide if I don't try. That dynamite could level this whole canyon if it goes off in the wrong place. Jake looked into his wife's eyes, memorizing the curve of her face, the fierce intelligence that had first drawn him to her. If something happens to me, nothing will happen to you. But if it does, you get to the sacred canyon. Take our child and raise him to know who his father was. Her, Aiyana corrected softly. And she will know. But you're going to tell her yourself because you're coming back. Jake kissed her, then hard and desperate tasting salt tears, his or hers, he couldn't tell. Then he was moving, slipping out the back door while the battle raged in the front yard. The root cellar lay 50 yards from the house, its entrance hidden behind a screen of prickly pear and sage. Jake had dug it himself during his first winter on the ranch, carving storage space from the living rock to keep supplies safe from both weather and raiders. Now it might become the instrument of his own destruction. He moved carefully through the smoke and chaos, using every scrap of cover available. A warrior materialized from behind a water trough, war club raised, but Jake's Colt spoke first. The man dropped without a sound, his painted face surprised even in death. 20 yards, 30. Jake could see the cellar entrance now and his heart sank. Mary Morrison was already there, along with 2 of Broken Hawk's most trusted fighters. They had pried up the wooden cover and were lowering themselves into the darkness below. Jake settled behind a pile of split firewood, drawing a careful bead on the cellar mouth. If he could keep them pinned down until Samuel's men could support him, I wouldn't if I were you. The voice came from directly behind him, cold and amused, and carrying the slight accent that had once whispered endearments in his ear. Jake froze, feeling the muzzle of a rifle press against the base of his skull. "Hello again, darling," Mary Morrison said. "Drop the gun." Jake let his Colt fall to the dust mind, racing through possibilities. Mary was alone. He could hear it in her voice, feel it in the confidence of her stance, but she had the drop on him, and at this range, even a mediocre shot couldn't miss. "You know," she continued conversationally, "I really am impressed. 7 years of mourning a dead wife and you still manage to find yourself a replacement. Rather exotic taste you've developed. What do you want, Mary? What I've always wanted, for you to stop complicating my work." The rifle muzzle pressed harder against his neck. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused? How many carefully laid plans you've disrupted with this ridiculous marriage? I'll try to do better next time. There won't be a next time, for any of us." Mary's voice carried genuine regret. "The railroad isn't patient, Jake. They want this territory pacified, and they want it done now. If that means every Apache in Arizona has to die, so be it. Including your new best friend, Broken Hawk. Especially him. He served his purpose stirring up warfare, giving the army an excuse to intervene, but loose cannons have a way of going off at inconvenient times." Mary chuckled softly. Amazing what a few sticks of dynamite can accomplish when properly placed. Jake felt Oz ice form in his veins. "You're planning to blow the cellar while he's in it. Him, his warriors, this entire ranch, everything that connects the railroad to recent unpleasantness. Very tragic, really. Renegade Apache terrorists destroy peaceful rancher and his pregnant wife with stolen explosives. The army will have to respond with overwhelming force. You're talking about genocide. I'm talking about progress, darling. The same progress that's bringing civilization to this wilderness, whether the locals want it or not." Mary's voice hardened. "Now, stand up. Slowly." Jake rose to his feet, hands raised while his mind worked frantically through escape options. Mary was too smart to get within arm's reach, too experienced to let her guard down even for a second. But she was also explaining her plan in detail, which suggested she intended him to die with full knowledge of how thoroughly he'd been beaten. "There's just one problem with your grand strategy," he said. "What's that? You're assuming I'm the only one who knows about it." Mary's laugh was silvery and cruel. "Your Apache friends, they'll be dead in 10 minutes. Your wife. Even if she escapes the explosion, a pregnant woman alone in the desert won't last a week." "I wasn't talking about them." "Then who?" The war cry that split the air came from directly above them. Jake threw himself sideways as Samuel Walking Bear dropped from the roof of the tool shed, landing on Mary Morrison like an avenging angel. Her rifle discharged harmlessly into the sky as they hit the ground together, rolling in the dust. Jake scrambled for his fallen Colt, but Samuel was already moving. The Buffalo Soldier had Mary pinned beneath him, his knife at her throat, his painted face a mask of controlled fury. "This is the woman who has been poisoning our people against each other," he said in Apache. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Jake replied in the same language, grateful for the lessons Aiyana had given him during their brief marriage. "Then she dies." "Wait," Jake held up a hand. "She has information we need, about the railroad, about what's coming next." Samuel considered this, then nodded slowly. Information first, then death. Mary Morrison looked up at the two men standing over her, one white, one black, both painted for war in the Apache fashion, and for the first time since Jake had known her, she looked genuinely afraid. "You can't just murder me," she said. "I'm a federal agent. There will be investigations, reprisals." "Against who?" Samuel asked mildly. According to Army records, Sergeant Samuel Walking Bear died of typhus on the reservation 3 years ago, and Jake Morrison is wanted for desertion, not exactly a credible witness. "The railroad will come looking for me." "The railroad already thinks you're dead. Amazing what a little Apache ingenuity can accomplish." Samuel's smile was winter cold. "We've been intercepting their communications for months. As far as they know, their agent Mary Morrison died in the explosion she was planning to set off herself." Jake stared at his new brother-in-law with growing respect. "You've been planning this for a while. 20 years, ever since they forced us onto the reservation and told us to be grateful for their generosity." Samuel's expression hardened. "But I learned something in the army that they didn't expect: how to think like them, how to plan like them, how to beat them at their own game." And now we finish what they started, but on our terms, not theirs. A new sound interrupted their conversation, the deep rumble of explosions echoing from the cellar below. Jake felt the ground shake beneath his feet as carefully placed charges detonated in sequence, sealing the underground chamber and trapping whatever remained of Broken Hawk's raiding party. "Your work?" he asked Samuel. "My men. We arrived hours ago, long before the fighting started. Plenty of time to make certain preparations." Samuel hauled Mary to her feet, keeping his knife at her throat, including messages to the territorial governor about railroad conspiracies and federal corruption. "You contacted the governor. Not just the governor, newspaper editors in Denver and San Francisco, federal marshals with clean records, even a few congressmen who've been asking uncomfortable questions about Indian policy." Samuel's grin was fierce. "By tonight, this story will be on telegraph wires from here to Washington." Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in days, genuine hope. "What about the warrant against me?" "What warrant? I'm afraid there's been a terrible mix-up in the territorial records. Happens all the time with military paperwork." Samuel winked. Amazing how much clerical work a man can accomplish when he has access to federal offices. Mary Morrison's face had gone pale as winter snow. "You don't understand what you're doing. The railroad has influence connections." "Had," Samuel corrected, past tense, "because right now their star agent is about to confess everything to territorial authorities, in writing, with witnesses." "I'll never—" "Oh, I think you will." Samuel's knife traced a delicate line along her jaw, not quite breaking skin. "Because the alternative is being turned over to Broken Hawk's remaining followers, and they have very creative ideas about justice." As if summoned by his words, a group of Apache warriors emerged from the smoke, their faces grim with battle fury. But these weren't Broken Hawk's men. Jake recognized them as Standing Bear's most trusted fighters, led by the chief himself. "Is it finished?" Standing Bear asked. "Nearly," Samuel replied, "but we still need the woman's testimony about railroad involvement. Once we have that in writing, the territorial authorities will have to act," Jake finished, "even if they don't want to." "Precisely. And while they're investigating, we consolidate our position. Samuel's Buffalo soldiers provide security. My warriors control the mountain passes, and your ranch becomes a symbol of successful cooperation between whites and Apache." Jake looked around at the assembled faces, Apache warriors and Negro cavalry, his pregnant wife appearing in the doorway with relief written across her features. Even Mary Morrison, whose schemes had brought them all to this point. "What about her?" he asked, nodding toward his former wife. "That depends on how cooperative she feels," Samuel said. "Full confession, complete list of railroad contacts, and detailed information about future plans in exchange for life imprisonment instead of immediate execution." Mary's eyes darted between the assembled warriors, calculating odds that grew worse with each passing second. Finally, her shoulders sagged in defeat. "I want guarantees," she said. "Protection, transportation to federal custody, assurance that I won't be handed over to Apache justice." "You're hardly in a position to negotiate," Standing Bear observed. "But I'm in a position to make this very expensive for everyone involved." Mary's voice regained some of its old steel. "The railroad has contingency plans. If I don't report in within 72 hours, they'll assume the worst and implement emergency protocols." "What kind of protocols?" Jake demanded. "Full military intervention. Federal troops, territorial militia, even hired mercenaries from Mexico. They'll claim Apache uprising, massacre of innocent civilians, threats to railroad construction." Mary's smile was bitter. "Your little victory here will become the excuse for everything you've been trying to prevent." Jake felt the fragile hope in his chest begin to crumble. "How do we stop it?" "You don't, unless—" Mary paused, studying their faces. "Unless you're willing to make a deal that serves everyone's interests." "What kind of deal?" "The railroad gets its right-of-way through Apache territory. Not the whole territory, just a narrow corridor for the tracks. In exchange, they recognize Apache sovereignty over the remaining land and provide annual payments for transit rights." Standing Bear's eyes narrowed. "And in return, I send word that the situation has been resolved peacefully. No military intervention, no emergency protocols, just a negotiated settlement that makes everyone rich." Jake looked at Aiyana, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. It wasn't the complete victory they'd hoped for, but it was survival. It was a future for their child, a chance to build something lasting in this harsh country. "What guarantees do we have that you'll keep your word?" he asked. "The same guarantee you're giving me: mutual self-interest. If I betray this agreement, I spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder for Apache justice. If you betray it, the railroad implements those emergency protocols and your people suffer the consequences." Samuel exchanged a long look with his brother, communicating in the wordless way of warriors who'd fought together. Finally, Standing Bear nodded. "We will consider your proposal," he said formally. "But first, you will put everything in writing: names, dates, plans, everything. And you will remain our guest until we're certain you're telling the truth." "Agreed." As Mary was led away under heavy guard, Jake found himself alone with his wife and new family. The ranch buildings were damaged, but repairable. The immediate threat was ended, and for the first time in days he could think beyond simple survival. "What happens now?" Aiyana asked, settling beside him on the porch steps. "Now we rebuild, we plan, we figure out how to make this crazy marriage work for the long term." Jake pulled her close, marveling again at how right it felt to hold her. "Think you can stand being married to a reformed cavalry officer turned Apache tribal member?" "I think I can manage." "As long as you can stand being married to a woman who trapped you into marriage by getting naked in your creek." Jake laughed, remembering that morning a lifetime ago when his biggest worry had been a missing steer. "Lady, that was the luckiest day of my life, even if I didn't know it at the time. And our child." Jake placed his hand over her belly, feeling the slight swell that carried their future. "Our child will grow up in a world where Apache and White can work together instead of trying to kill each other. That's worth any price." As the sun set over the damaged ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake Morrison sat with his Apache wife and contemplated the strange turns his life had taken. A week ago, he'd been a lonely widower mourning a woman who'd never existed. Now, he was part of something larger: a family, a tribe, a new way of living in the American West. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he'd chosen. And as Aiyana's head settled against his shoulder and her hand found his, Jake Morrison decided it was exactly the life he wanted. The future stretched ahead like an uncharted territory full of challenges and possibilities in equal measure. But whatever came next, they would face it together, White and Apache, husband and wife, two people who had found in each other something worth fighting for. And in the gathering darkness of the Arizona desert, that seemed like victory enough. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood in the doorway of his rebuilt ranch house, watching his pregnant wife tend to the vegetable garden they'd planted where the old barn used to stand. Aiyana moved carefully in the morning heat, one hand supporting her swollen belly while the other guided their irrigation channels with practiced precision. In 3 weeks, maybe less, their child would be born into a world that bore little resemblance to the one that had nearly destroyed them. "The railroad delegation arrives today," Samuel Walking Bear said, emerging from the house with 2 cups of coffee steaming in the desert air. "Are you ready for this?" Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, as ready as a man can be for signing his life away to progress. He gestured toward the valley below, where railroad survey stakes marked the future path of the Arizona and Pacific line. "Still seems strange seeing civilization come to this place." "Civilization was already here, brother. We just convinced the white man to recognize it." It was true enough. The agreement, hammered out over Mary Morrison's written confession, had transformed the territory in ways none of them had anticipated. Apache sovereignty over their traditional lands was now federal law, backed by congressional appropriations and territorial legislation. The railroad got its corridor, a narrow strip just wide enough for tracks and maintenance facilities, while everything else remained under tribal control. But the real victory was quieter, more personal. It was Jake Morrison, former cavalry officer and wanted fugitive, now legally adopted into the Chiricahua Apache as nephew to Chief Standing Bear. It was the Buffalo Soldier Regiment that had officially been disbanded while actually serving as territorial peacekeepers under Apache command. It was the careful balance between two worlds that seemed to be holding, at least for now. "Any word from the territorial governor?" Jake asked. "He'll be here for the signing ceremony, along with a federal judge, 3 newspaper correspondents, and enough politicians to populate a small town." Samuel's grin was wry. Everyone wants to be associated with the Great Apache Peace Initiative. And Mary, Samuel's expression darkened. Still in federal custody in Santa Fe, still claiming she was acting under proper authority when she orchestrated the whole mess. Her trial starts next month. Jake nodded, sipping his coffee while he watched Aiyana work. The month since their desperate fight had been a whirlwind of negotiations, investigations, and careful political maneuvering. Mary Morrison's detailed confession had implicated dozens of railroad officials, territorial bureaucrats, and federal agents in a conspiracy that reached all the way to Washington. The scandal had ended careers, launched congressional investigations, and ultimately forced the kind of honest negotiation between whites and Apache that should have happened decades earlier. But it had also made Jake Morrison a very wealthy man. "The mineral rights survey came back yesterday," he said casually. Samuel raised an eyebrow. "And copper, lots of it, enough to make the railroad deal look like pocket change." Jake's smile was sharp. Funny how nobody thought to check what was under the ground before they tried to steal it. The spirits work in mysterious ways. The spirits and a good geological survey team. Jake looked at his brother-in-law with genuine affection. Samuel had proved to be a master strategist, thinking 3 moves ahead while everyone else was still figuring out the game. When do we tell Standing Bear? After the signing ceremony. Let the white politicians have their moment of glory before we remind them who really controls this territory. Aiyana approached the porch, wiping dirt from her hands on her apron. Her pregnancy showed clearly now, 7 months along, and carrying what the Apache midwives insisted would be twins. The thought of becoming father to 2 children simultaneously still left Jake feeling slightly dizzy. "How are you feeling?" he asked, helping her up the steps. "Like I swallowed a pair of fighting wildcats." She settled into the rocking chair he'd built for her, one hand rubbing the small of her back. "But the midwives say everything is progressing normally." "And you believe them?" "I believe the spirits will not take these children from us, not after everything we've endured to bring them into the world." Aiyana's voice carried the quiet confidence that had first attracted Jake to her. "They are meant to be here, Jake Morrison, just as you were meant to be here." Jake still marveled at how easily she'd adapted to being the wife of a man caught between worlds. The ranch had become a gathering place for Apache and white settlers alike, a neutral ground where business could be conducted without the constant threat of violence. Aiyana served as translator-mediator and unofficial diplomat, her natural intelligence and fierce personality making her a formidable negotiator in her own right. "The contracts are ready for signing," Samuel said. "Railroad gets their corridor, Apache Nation gets sovereignty and annual payments, copper mining rights remain under tribal control. Everyone gets rich, nobody gets shot." Sounds too good to be true. It probably is, but it's also the best deal anyone's going to get, and everyone knows it. Samuel finished his coffee and stood. "The real test comes in 5 years when the railroad is complete and every fortune hunter in America comes looking for copper claims. We'll deal with that when it happens." "Yes," Aiyana added quietly. "We will. All of us together." The signing ceremony took place at noon in the shade of the great cottonwood tree where Jake had once buried 2 strangers thinking they were his wife and son. Territorial Governor Lewis Wolfley presided, flanked by federal officials, railroad executives, and Apache leaders in full ceremonial dress. Newspaper correspondents scribbled notes while photographers captured images for posterity. Jake signed first, his name flowing across the treaty documents in bold strokes that committed him to a future he was still learning to imagine. Then, Standing Bear added his mark, eagle feathers, stirring in the desert breeze as he formally ceded the railroad corridor while retaining everything else. Railroad President Collis Huntington signed next, his expression carefully neutral, despite the fact that this deal was costing his company millions more than originally budgeted. But it was the final signature that carried the most weight. Governor Wolfley's endorsement made the agreement territorial law, backed by federal authority and congressional appropriation. For the first time in the history of the American West, an Indian tribe had negotiated as equals with white authorities and emerged with their sovereignty intact. "Gentlemen," Governor Wolfley announced to the assembled crowd, "we are witnessing history. This agreement proves that with good faith on both sides, whites and Indians can coexist prosperously in these territories." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Jake caught Samuel's eye, and saw his own thoughts reflected there. The governor was taking credit for a deal that had been hammered out despite official opposition, not because of official support. But politicians would be politicians, and the important thing was that the agreement now carried the full weight of territorial law. As the crowd began to disperse, a commotion near the ranch house caught Jake's attention. A dust cloud on the horizon resolved into a single rider approaching at full gallop, a young Apache scout bearing the painted marks of an urgent message. Standing Bear intercepted the rider before he reached the main gathering, listening intently as the young man delivered his report in rapid Apache. Jake saw the chief's expression change from curiosity to concern to something approaching alarm. "What is it?" Jake asked, moving closer. "Mary Morrison," Standing Bear said grimly. "She has escaped federal custody." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. "How?" "During transport to her trial, the escort was ambushed near Albuquerque, 3 federal marshals dead, the prisoner wagon overturned." Standing Bear's jaw was granite. She had help, professional help. Samuel appeared at Jake's shoulder, his face grim. "How long ago?" 2 days, maybe 3. The chief looked toward the ranch house where Aiyana was resting. "She could be anywhere by now." Jake felt ice settle in his stomach. Mary Morrison was brilliant, ruthless, and intimately familiar with every detail of their lives. She knew about the pregnancy, about the copper deposits, about the careful political balance they'd built. And she had every reason to want revenge on the people who'd destroyed her carefully laid plans. "Double the guards," he said. "Nobody goes anywhere alone, especially Aiyana." "Already done," Samuel replied. "But Jake, if she's really working with professional killers now, guards might not be enough." "Then what do you suggest? We find her first." The War Council convened that evening in Jake's parlor, the same room where he'd once sat alone, mourning a woman who'd never died. Maps covered every surface marked with possible escape routes, known criminal contacts, and the locations of federal facilities where Mary might seek allies or resources. "She's not running," Samuel concluded after hours of analysis. "Look at the pattern. The ambush happened close to railroad territory. Her known contacts are all in Arizona or New Mexico. She's coming back." "For what?" Governor Wolfley asked. The politician had insisted on joining their planning session, much to everyone's irritation. "Revenge," Aiyana said simply. She sat in her rocking chair, hands resting on her swollen belly, but her dark eyes were sharp with intelligence. She cannot bear to be defeated by people she considers inferior. It is not about money or politics anymore. It is about pride. Apache wisdom. Standing? Bear nodded approvingly. "The deadliest enemy is one with nothing left to lose." Jake studied the maps, his tactical mind working through possibilities. If she's coming back, she'll need a base of operations, somewhere she can plan, gather resources, coordinate with whatever help she's hired. "The old mining camps," Samuel suggested. "Plenty of abandoned buildings, defensible positions close enough to threaten the ranch, but far enough away to avoid patrols." "Or Tucson," Governor Wolfley added. "Lots of places to hide in a city, plenty of criminal contacts." "No." Jake's certainty surprised even himself. "She's not going to hide in a city. Mary always preferred to control the battlefield, to choose the time and place of confrontation." He pointed to a spot on the map, a box canyon 15 miles north of the ranch. "Here. The old Spanish silver mine. It's remote, defensible, and it overlooks the entire valley." Standing Bear studied the location. "Difficult to approach without being seen. Easy to defend with the small force. Yes, I think you are right." "So what do we do?" Wolfley asked. "We go get her," Jake said simply. Aiyana's voice carried sharp concern. "You have a pregnant wife and unborn children to consider." "Which is exactly why I have to go. Mary Morrison won't stop until she's dead, or we are. And I'll be damned if I let my children be born into a world where she's still a threat." The argument that followed was intense but brief. Aiyana wanted him to stay and let Samuel's warriors handle the threat. Governor Wolfley insisted on involving federal authorities. Samuel pointed out that a large force would be spotted miles away and give Mary time to escape. In the end, it was Standing Bear who settled the matter. "This is family business," he said with quiet authority. "Jake Morrison has the right to face the woman who poisoned his life. Samuel Walking Bear has the skills to ensure they both return alive. The rest of us will wait here and guard what matters most." At dawn, Jake Morrison and Samuel Walking Bear rode north toward the old Spanish mine, following deer trails and hidden paths that would keep them invisible to watchers on the ridges. Each carried a rifle, a sidearm, and the bitter knowledge that this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment Mary Morrison chose revenge over acceptance. "You know this could be a trap," Samuel said as they approached the canyon. "Probably is. Mary's too smart to face us on equal terms if she can help it." Jake checked his weapons automatically. "But she's also too proud to run forever. She'll want to finish this face to face. And if you're wrong, then my children will grow up knowing their father died trying to protect them." The old mine perched on a ledge halfway up the canyon wall, its entrance framed by weathered timbers and decades of accumulated debris. From this position, a defender could see for miles in every direction, perfect for someone who wanted to spot trouble coming long before it arrived. But Jake Morrison had learned a few things about warfare during his cavalry years. He and Samuel approached from below using the canyon's shadows and the sound of running water to mask their movements. By the time they reached the mine entrance, the sun was directly overhead, creating a glare that would make it difficult for anyone inside to see clearly. "Mary!" Jake called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I know you're in there. Time we finish this." Silence, then faintly the sound of laughter. "Hello, darling," came the familiar voice from the mine's depths. "I was wondering when you'd work up the courage to come calling." Jake stepped into the entrance tunnel, rifle ready but not raised. The passage led back into the mountain for 50 feet before opening into the main excavation chamber. Plenty of room for an ambush, but also nowhere for Mary to retreat if things went badly. "You alone in there?" he asked. "Does it matter? You're here now, aren't you?" Mary's voice carried an odd note, something between triumph and desperation. "Come ahead, Jake. Let's see how much your Apache friends have taught you about courage." Jake moved deeper into the mine, Samuel covering his back. The tunnel was dark and narrow, carved from living rock by Spanish miners centuries ago in their endless search for silver. Water dripped from the ceiling and the air smelled of dampness and decay. The main chamber opened before them, like an underground cathedral, shafts of sunlight streaming down from above where the roof had partially collapsed. And there, seated on a boulder in the center of the space, was Mary Morrison. She looked older, thinner, her blonde hair dirty and unkempt, but her blue eyes still held the cold intelligence that had once captivated him, and the rifle across her knees was steady in her hands. "You look well, Jake. Marriage agrees with you." "Can't say the same for federal prison." "Oh, I wouldn't know. I was never actually in prison, just federal custody. Amazing how much freedom a woman can have when everyone thinks she's properly secured." Mary's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Did you really think a few guards in a locked wagon would hold someone who spent 20 years infiltrating enemy territory?" Jake kept his rifle ready but pointed down. "What do you want, Mary? What I've always wanted, for you to stop interfering with my work." She gestured around the abandoned mine. "Do you know what this place is worth? There's enough silver in these walls to fund a private army, and below us in the deeper shafts, there's something even more valuable. Such as information." Spanish records dating back 300 years detailing every mineral deposit between here and Mexico City. Mary's eyes glittered with avarice. The railroad consortium would pay millions for that kind of intelligence. Jake felt understanding dawn. This was never about the Apache Treaty, was it? You've been planning this from the beginning, using the conflicts to drive people away from the mining camps so you could search them yourself. Very good. Yes, the Apache Wars were just convenient cover for my real work. Every attack, every massacre, every broken treaty, all designed to clear the territory so I could explore without interference. Mary stood slowly, rifle still in her hands, until you complicated everything with your ridiculous marriage. So you decided to eliminate the complication. I decided to salvage what I could from a deteriorating situation, but then your Apache friends had to involve federal authorities, and suddenly my entire operation was at risk. Mary's voice hardened. Do you have any idea how much money I've lost because of your heroic gesture? Not enough, apparently, since you're still here. Oh, I'm here for a very specific reason. Mary raised her rifle slightly. You see, there's one more secret in this mine, something the Spanish left behind when they abandoned it. What kind of secret? The kind that goes boom. Jake's blood turned to ice. Explosives. Black powder, barrels and barrels of it still stable after all these years. Amazing how well things preserve in a dry climate. Mary's smile was genuinely insane now. Enough to level this entire canyon and everyone in it, including yourself, including myself. Because you see, darling, if I can't have what I want, I'll make sure nobody else can either. Mary's finger moved to her rifle's trigger. Your Apache treaty, the railroad deal, the copper deposits, all of it depends on this territory remaining stable. But if a mysterious explosion eliminates key figures from both sides, the federal government will send troops. The federal government will declare martial law and seize everything for national security purposes. My surviving contacts in the railroad consortium will then purchase mining rights at government auction for a fraction of their real value. Mary's laugh was bright and terrible. Amazing how quickly indigenous land rights disappear when there's a proper crisis to justify intervention. Jake exchanged a glance with Samuel, seeing his own grim understanding reflected in the Apache warrior's eyes. Mary Morrison was beyond reason, now driven by a combination of greed and wounded pride that made her genuinely dangerous. There's just one problem with your plan, Jake said. What's that? You're assuming I came here alone. Mary's expression flickered with uncertainty. Samuel Walking Bear doesn't count. 2 men against prepared explosives is still suicide. I wasn't talking about Samuel. The war cry that echoed through the mine came from above, where Aiyana Crow Feather Morrison lowered herself through the collapsed roof on a rope made from braided rawhide. Despite her advanced pregnancy, she moved with fluid grace, landing behind Mary's position with barely a sound. "Hello, sister," she said in perfect English, her bow already drawn with an arrow nocked. "We need to talk." Mary spun toward this new threat, but Jake was already moving. His rifle came up as he dove for cover behind a pile of mining debris, Samuel doing the same on the opposite side of the chamber. The space that had been large and open suddenly became a triangle of deadly angles, with each combatant covering the others. Clever. Mary admitted her own weapon tracking between targets, but still pointless. Even if you kill me, the explosives are rigged with a dead man's switch. My heart stops beating, this whole mountain comes down. "Show me?" Aiyana said calmly. Mary gestured with her free hand toward a stack of barrels near the mine's far wall. Jake could see the glint of metal wires and mechanisms that looked disturbingly professional. "Mercenary work," Samuel observed. "Someone spent serious money on this setup. The railroad consortium has deep pockets when properly motivated." Mary's rifle never wavered. "So what now? Mexican standoff until one of us makes a mistake." "Now," said a new voice from the mine entrance, "you put down your weapons and surrender to federal authority." Governor Wolfley stepped into the chamber flanked by 2 federal marshals and half a dozen Apache warriors. He looked absurdly out of place in his formal suit and political bearing, but his presence changed everything about the tactical situation. "How did you," Mary began, "find you?" "Your escape was a little too convenient, Miss Morrison. We've been tracking you since Albuquerque, waiting to see who you contacted and where you went." Wolfley's smile was coldly political. Amazing what federal resources can accomplish when properly applied. Jake realized they'd all been played. The escape, the chase, even this confrontation, it had all been orchestrated to expose Mary's remaining contacts and discover the full extent of the conspiracy. "The dead man's switch," Mary started, "was disarmed an hour ago by Army engineers," one of the marshals said calmly. "Amazing what you can accomplish when you approach from multiple directions." Mary Morrison's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, rage, calculation, and finally a kind of bitter acceptance. The rifle in her hands wavered, then slowly lowered. "It would have worked," she said quietly. "If you'd all just followed the script, it would have worked beautifully." "Maybe," Jake said, emerging from cover, "but you made one critical mistake." "What was that?" "You underestimated what people will do for their families," as federal marshals moved to arrest Mary Morrison. For the final time, Jake found himself standing beside his pregnant wife in the depths of a Spanish silver mine, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that had reached from territorial politics to the halls of Congress. It should have felt like victory, but mostly it felt like exhaustion. "Is it over?" Aiyana asked, leaning against him as their unborn children moved restlessly in her belly. "This part is," Jake replied. But there'll be trials, investigations, probably more attempts by other railroad interests to manipulate territorial politics. And we'll face them, all of us together. Governor Wolfley approached them as Mary was led away in shackles. Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Morrison, on behalf of the territorial government, I want to thank you for your cooperation in this matter. Just doing what needed doing, Jake said. Yes, well, there will likely be a congressional commendation, possibly a presidential citation. This conspiracy reached very high levels, and exposing it serves the national interest. Jake looked at Aiyana, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. Congressional commendations and presidential citations were all well and good. But what mattered was simpler than politics, the chance to raise their children in peace, to build something lasting in this harsh but beautiful country. Governor, he said, I appreciate the sentiment, but what we really need is for people to honor the agreements we've already signed. Let the Apache Nation keep its sovereignty, let the railroad build its corridor, and let the rest of us get on with our lives. Of course, although Wolfley's expression grew calculating. There has been some discussion about expanding the railroad corridor given the mineral wealth that's been discovered. Nothing major, just a few additional miles to accommodate mining operations. No. Aiyana's voice cut across the politician's words like a blade. The agreements stand as written. No expansions, no modifications, no renegotiation. But surely in light of changed circumstances, Governor. Samuel Walking Bear stepped forward, his hand resting on his sidearm. My sister-in-law said no. Among the Apache, when a woman says no, that ends the discussion. Wolfley looked around at the assembled faces, Apache warriors, federal marshals, and Jake Morrison himself, and apparently decided that discretion was the better part of political ambition. Of course, he said hastily, the agreements stand as written. 3 weeks later, Aiyana Morrison gave birth to twins during a thunderstorm that shook the ranch house to its foundations. Jake paced the parlor while Apache midwives attended his wife, listening to the sounds of labor mixed with thunder, and wondering if the timing was coincidence or another message from the spirits his new family believed watched over them. The first child arrived just as lightning split the sky, a daughter with her mother's dark hair and fierce cry. The second followed 20 minutes later, a son who emerged quietly as if already contemplating the world he'd been born into. What will you name them? Standing Bear asked, cradling his granddaughter while Jake held his son. Jake looked at Aiyana, exhausted but radiant in the aftermath of birth. They'd discussed names during the long months of pregnancy, but somehow the decision felt different now that he could see their faces. Sarah, Aiyana said, touching their daughter's tiny hand, for the wife you loved and lost. And Thomas, Jake added, looking down at his son, for the boy I raised as my own, even if he wasn't my blood. Standing Bear nodded approvingly. Good names. Names that honor the past while embracing the future. Outside, the storm was beginning to break. Shafts of sunlight penetrated the clouds, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. The ranch building stood solid, and repaired the railroad corridor marked its peaceful path through the valley. And somewhere in Santa Fe, Mary Morrison was beginning what would likely be a very long prison sentence. But inside the house that had sheltered Jake Morrison's grief and now housed his joy, all that mattered was the small family gathered around two newborn children who would grow up in a world their parents had fought to create. Any regrets? Aiyana asked, echoing the question she'd posed on their wedding night. Jake looked around at the assembled faces, his Apache family, his mixed-race children, the life he'd built from the ashes of betrayal and loss. It wasn't the future he'd planned, but it was the future he'd chosen. And it was more than he'd ever dared hope for during those long years of solitude. Ask me in 20 years, he said, borrowing her words from months ago, but this time he was smiling when he said it. As evening fell over the Arizona territory, Jake Morrison sat on his porch with his wife and children, watching the lights come on in the Apache camp across the valley. The railroad was a distant ribbon of possibility. The copper mines were carefully managed joint ventures, and the territorial government had learned to negotiate rather than dictate. It wasn't perfect, no human arrangement ever was, but it was sustainable, profitable, and based on mutual respect rather than mutual fear. And for a man who'd started this journey as a lonely widower chasing a stray steer, that seemed like a pretty good outcome. What are you thinking about? Aiyana asked, settling beside him with Thomas in her arms while Sarah slept in his. Home, Jake said, surprised by how easily the word came. I'm thinking about home. This place, all of it. The ranch, the valley, the people, the whole complicated, beautiful mess we've built together. Jake looked down at his sleeping daughter, marveling at how something so small could represent such enormous hope. I'm thinking about how lucky I am that a naked woman in my creek decided I was worth the gamble. Aiyana laughed, the sound carrying across the desert night like music. Best gamble I ever made. As the stars emerged overhead and coyotes began their ancient songs in the distance, Jake Morrison held his family close and contemplated the future stretching ahead like uncharted territory. There would be challenges. Certainly there always were when different peoples tried to build something together. But there would also be opportunities, possibilities, and the kind of hope that came from choosing love over fear. And in the end, that seemed like victory enough for any man's lifetime.